God is faithful. Make no excuses. God will do what he says he'll do. Now, I love Ecuador. And I love Ecuador because every time I go to Ecuador, it seems as though the pages of Scripture just come to life for me. And the last time I went to Ecuador just a couple years ago, we had the extreme privilege of working with a church in Apatug, a little village in Apatug is what it's called. And the story of this church is so powerful. There's a bunch of Quechua people. And the story of this church happened some 25, 26 years ago. The missionary, his name is Steve, he had been on the field for only about a year or two when one day he had a strange visitor come to his gate. And the visitor kind of summoned for him. He opened the gate and said, "Hey, come on in." And this guy refused to come in because he grew up his entire life believing that he and his Quechua people were second-class citizens who were unworthy to enter into a civilized person's home. And so he just stayed at the gate and he said, "Are you the missionary?" And Steve said, "I am the missionary." And he said, "Could you come to Apatug? There are believers there who need your help." And so Steve went and found about 5 or 6 believers in Apatug. Now, Apatug was a Roman Catholic village, very hostile to evangelical Christianity. These 5 or 6 believers were having to have an underground church. They had to be secret about their faith. And so Steve began to disciple these 5 or 6 believers, and they grew to a whopping 11 believers. I mean, revival was breaking out here in Apatug. And so there were 11 believers. And so one night, Steve wasn't with them, but one night these 11 believers met together in a house. They began to worship the Lord. They were having Bible study and all that stuff. And the village found out that the evangelicals had come and had converted these 11 believers. So they surrounded the house, and they beat against the house. They beat against the walls. They beat against the door, trying to get these people out. And finally, they were successfully able to knock a hole in the wall. They pulled these 11 believers out into the street in the middle of the night. They stripped them naked, and they beat them with bull nettle, and they tied them up and took them as high as they could in the mountain. Now listen, Apatug is already 11,000 feet above sea level, and it's already cold. And they were in the mountains, and so they took them as high as they could to make it as cold as possible. They submerged them in water, and then they left them to freeze to death. One of the guys was successfully able to untie himself, and he untied the rest of the 11 believers, and they walked back down the mountain to their village. And it was getting about morning time at this time. All the people were coming out of the road. And as they walked into the village, people began to see them, began to cuss them, make fun of them, ridicule them. You see, the most shameful thing for a Quechua person is their nakedness, most humiliating thing. And they had to walk in the streets like that as people made fun of them. And they walked back to the house that they were at just the day before, only to find it reduced to rubble. Something interesting happened that changed the course of history for them. As there was a 14-year-old girl who was one of the believers that night. Her father was one of the attackers that night. And the father recounts the story like this. He says, "When I saw my 14-year-old daughter return to the house that we had destroyed, only to worship God again, I knew she had something that I didn't have." Isn't that good? And he gave his life to the Lord shortly after that. And now, 25 years later, that church is thriving. There's over 200 believers in Apatug. The community is open to evangelical Christianity. We were there just a couple years ago, actually 2 years ago, and I was able to clean out this old hole-in-the-wall building because they hired their first full-time pastor. Isn't that good? They hired their first full-time pastor, and that was going to be his parsonage. That was his payment. And this building that they were in was tiny, but they would pack it every week with 200 plus believers. Why? Because God is faithful. Make no excuses. God will do what he says he'll do.